In 1889, Brazil became a federal republic, after a small coup ousted Emperor Pedro II. However, many were still left disenfranchised, but as a federal republic, parties often only represented state interests. In particular, Minister Rice and Sao Paulo, the most wealthy states and important ones. Other states in the northern interior were left weakened after the abolition of slavery and development of new foreign markets for rubber and sugar. Plus, poor infrastructure and schooling left them isolated, and the majority of the population uneducated. Plus, real power was in the hands of the coronels, elites who, through their great wealth, had whole populations dependent on them and therefore loyal to them. And as voting was not secret, they could decide who could vote in their region, and often did so in exchange for political favors, making Brazil more of an oligarchic republic. So in the late 19th century, an agreement was made. The Republican parties representing Sao Paulo and Minister Rice would take it in turns running for elections, and therefore always secure the presidency. And as minister, Rice largely produced dairy products and Sao Paulo produced coffee. It is known as the coffee with milk politics. But industrialization in the South created a new wealthy, but largely disenfranchised bourgeoisie. Urban middle class and millions of European immigrants brought ideas of anarchism and trade unionism. So there were huge general strikes between 1917 and 1919, but the first real challenge to the coffee with milk politics came from the army with a political movement known as tenentismo. This was made up of a small number of young officers who hoped to reform the political structure, but their first small rebellion in Rio in 1922 was unsuccessful. Meanwhile, in Rio Grande do Sul, a civil war erupted in the state when in 1923, Portos de Medeiros was re-elected as state president. A ceasefire was signed the year later, and it was agreed Portos would serve just one more term. But importantly, a young politician named Vargas sided with Borges in the struggle, aiding his rise in national politics. The followers of Tenente Esma rose up again in Sao Paulo in 1924, but failed to hold on to the city. However, under Luis Carlos Prestes, more rose up in Rio Grande do Sul and avoided government forces for a couple of years as they marched through the interior of Brazil, demonstrating the government's weak control there before fleeing to Bolivia. Plus, some from the south, Paula Republican Party, split off and formed the Democratic Party in 1925, looking to push through some minor reforms. And communist and fascist parties were growing in their numbers, especially amongst the immigrant communities. Nevertheless, the coffee with milk policy continued, as President Arturo Bonadias from Minister Rice handed power over to Washington Luis from Sao Paulo in 1926. And as a favor to Borges, he agreed to appoint Vargas as a minister until 1928. When he resigned to become president of Rio Grande do Sul, Washington Luis, however, took out more foreign loans to work on great infrastructure projects. Plus, since 1906, the government had been buying coffee harvests in order to control the prices on the international market during an overproductive harvest. But when the market crashed in 1929, the government was left with a huge reserve that they could not sell. Washington Luis broke with a coffee with milk policy and appointed another Sao Paulo politician, Julio Prestes, as his successor in order to ensure Sao Paulo's coffee industry would have government support. During this crisis, this, however, shook the status quo, so the Liberal Party was formed, led by Vargas and the state president of Paraíba, João Pessoa. This included members from the splinter Sao Paulo Democratic Party, bourgeois intellectuals, industrialists, military men from the Tenentismo movement, and leaders in Minister Ries. But they still lost the election. So, claiming fraud, they sought to forcibly take power. Before Prestes was inaugurated in November, this revolution began on October 3rd, and across the country, rebellious soldiers rose up. From the Rio Grande do Sul, Gaucho troops marched north, capturing Santa Catarina, and in Paraná, soldiers overthrew the government there. But in Misiones, the 12th Infantry Regiment refused to participate, and this resulted in heavy fighting across the state for 5 days. The rebels, however, still won and quickly marched east to take a spirit of Santo. And in the north, most of the state governments were toppled by mutinous soldiers, leaving the government really only in control of Sao Paulo, Rio, and Bahia by mid-October. Nevertheless, the well-entrenched government troops held off the rebels' march on Sao Paulo for a while, but retreated to Itarare on the 17th. There they expected a decisive battle to take place. But by now, the government's general staff feared a prolonged civil war. and some were sympathetic to the rebels, so they surrounded the presidential palace and forced Washington Lewis to resign. On the 24th, they set up a junta, but were unable to get the rebels to lay down their arms. So they handed power over to Vargas just a week later, and he would rule Brazil until 1945.